Hello everyone! So my name is Efthymia Chatzi, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the relationship of positive psychological habits to self-awareness and well-being. So this is the project that I ran as part of my MSc in Theories of Counseling. So I'm going to start by saying a few things about myself. This is me in the photo, as you can see. It was back in 2019 when I was in Maynard's library at Bangor University. And it was actually before I started this chapter that is called Masters, so I thought to use this picture because this chapter is now closing. A few more things about myself is that I've done my bachelor degree in psychology at Bangor University, and then once I graduated, I started my master's in theories of counseling, and now I'm currently on my second year of this master's, again at Bangor University. Something that I really like to do is to help people as well as spend time with them, and this is one of the reasons that I chose counseling. And finally, a big passion of mine is dance, since, I remember myself dancing since I was very little, so yeah, it's a really big passion of mine. Now coming back to the project. Like I mentioned before, the current study will explain the relationship of positive psychological habits to self-awareness and well-being. So I'll start by saying a few things about well-being. So well-being is distinguished into subjective well-being and to objective well-being. Objective well-being refers to material resources, such as having an income, having food to eat, having a house to live, and to social attributes such as education, have a political voice, those type of things. On the contrary, subjective well-being refers to happiness and to life satisfaction, so things that are subjective to each one of us. So something that might make me happy might not make other people happy. In the current study, we're focusing on subjective well-being, so on happiness, on what makes people happy. Then we have self-awareness. And the association between psychological well-being and self-awareness has been supported by research through the fact that individuals who are aware of their feelings and their emotions, they are also able to recognize them. And in this way, they're able to regulate them. So if somebody is not really aware of their feelings, they're not able to regulate them, and then that can result in decreased well-being. Moreover, research suggests that positive psychological tools and high levels of self-awareness have been linked to improved levels of well-being. So those three are associated. In the current study, positive tools referred to positive psychological habits, and we're measuring the frequency and the formality of those habits. So frequency refers to how often the participants are engaging to a habit, and formality refers to the way that they're practicing this habit. So for example, in a formal way of practicing a habit would be to have scheduled the habit or to do it in a guided way, and an informal way to do a habit is to do it spontaneously. So the hypothesis of the current study is that participants who report more frequent engagement in positive psychological habits will report higher levels of self-awareness and higher levels of well-being. And then participants who report engaging in more formal positive psychological habits will report higher levels of self-awareness and well-being. So we have 4 hypotheses. Moving on to the method section, the participants were recruited through opportunity sampling. The study basically was advertised on the researchers' Facebook profiles and on SONA. SONA is a student participant panel of Bangor University. So as you can understand, some participants were students at Bangor University and some other some other participants were not students. There were 350 participants in total, but only 233 participants' data was analyzed. The reason that that happened is because some of the participants have not completed the whole study, so we decided to actually analyze only the data of the participants who have completed all parts, all sections of the study. There were 26% of males in the study and 74% of females. So there were 3 questionnaires that helped us measure well-being, self-awareness, and positive psychological habits. I will start with the first one, which was the PERMA Profiler Questionnaire by Butler and Kern. This questionnaire helped us measure well-being, and PERMA is an acronym that stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment. So 5 aspects of life. This questionnaire also measures health and negative emotions, but they're not usually included on the analysis. However, we as researchers decided to use those 2 aspects of life alongside the 5 aspects of life that I've mentioned before. The questionnaire consists of 23 items and it's on a Likert scale. It goes from 0 up to 10, 0 meaning never and 10 meaning always. The second questionnaire is from Chatzi and is the Self-Awareness Outcome Questionnaire that helped us measure self-awareness. It consists of 38 items, but we only used the first 24 questions. And the reason we did that is because we wanted all the questionnaires to contain a similar number of questions. So this one is on a Likert scale and it goes from never to almost always. The third questionnaire that was used was the Positive Psychological Habits Questionnaire, and it was a novel set of questions designed by the researchers. This questionnaire consists of 2 parts. The first part is measuring frequency and the second part is measuring formality. Let's talk first about the first part. So the first part consists of 23 items and it's on a Likert scale. So participants would be able to say whether they were engaging to a habit constantly, daily, weekly, monthly, occasionally, or maybe never. The habits that were included on this first part were distinguished into 3 categories: the cognitive, physical, and both habits categories. So cognitive habits would be habits that only include a cognitive element, physical habits would be habits that include only a physical element, and both habits would be habits that include both a cognitive and a physical element. So for example, a cognitive habit could be meditation, a physical habit could be working out, and a both habit would be writing a diary, because when you write a diary you need to physically do something, you need to write, and you also need to think. So in this way you have a cognitive and a physical element. And the second part was measuring formality. The second part, it included of 14 items and it was on a Likert scale. So like I've mentioned before, formality here refers on how the participant is engaging with a habit. Is it guided, is it scheduled, or is it spontaneous? And again, habits were distinguished in 3 categories again, the same categories as they were mentioned above. Moving on to the results section, the researchers decided to run a Spearman's correlation coefficient analysis in order to find the relationship between the frequency of positive psychological habits and self-awareness. And as you can see here on the table and the scatter plot, we did find a significant positive correlation between the frequency of positive psychological habits and self-awareness. As you can see here, the p-value is .000, which indicates that there is a significant positive correlation. Moving on into testing the second hypothesis, we found out that frequency of positive psychological habits and well-being are not correlated. So there is no correlation between those two variables. And we can see that from both the scatter plot and the table that is presented here. We can see that the p-value is .273, which it indicates that there is no correlation between those two variables. For the hypothesis number 3, again, we ran a Spearman's correlation coefficient analysis in order to see whether there is a correlation between the formal engagement of positive psychological habits and self-awareness, and we found out that there is no correlation between those two variables. Again, we can see that from the scatter plot presented here and from the table. So the p-value here is .147, which again, it indicates that there is no correlation between those two variables. Moving on into testing the fourth hypothesis, we found out that formal engagement of positive psychological habits and well-being are not correlated. And we have the scatter plot here again and the table. So the p-value here is .172, which again, it indicates that there is no correlation between those two variables. So when I saw that there was a positive correlation between the frequency of positive psychological habits and self-awareness, I decided to run a post hoc analysis in order to break down the positive psychological habits into the 3 categories that I've mentioned to you before: the cognitive habits, physical habits, and both habits. So the habits that include both a cognitive and a physical element. So here in the slide we can see that the frequency of cognitive psychological habits and self-awareness have indeed a significant positive correlation. As we can see here on the scatter plot and on the table, the p-value is .000, which it indicates that there is a significant positive correlation between those two variables. Moving on into the both category, so habits that include both a physical and a cognitive element, I found out that the frequency of both positive psychological habits and self-awareness have a significant positive correlation. And again, here we can see it on the scatter plot and on the table. And the p-value here is again .000, which indicates a strong positive correlation. Finally, the correlation analysis showed that there is no correlation between the frequency of physical habits and self-awareness. And we can also see this again from the scatter plot presented here and from the table here. So the p-value here is .272, which it indicates that there is no correlation between those two variables. Moving on into the discussion section, I will show you what our hypotheses were and we will discuss them. So the first hypothesis was that participants who report more frequent engagement in positive psychological habits will report higher levels of self-awareness. And indeed, we found out that this is true. Now, a reason that this might be happening could be because positive psychological habits require self-awareness to be present in order to complete the task. So maybe it's the nature of the habit that requires self-awareness. So for example, when someone is meditating or when someone is writing a journal, self-awareness is required in order to complete the task. And thus the more frequent someone is engaging with the activity, the more self-aware they become. The second hypothesis was that participants who report more frequent engagement in positive psychological habits will report higher levels of well-being. However, we refuted this hypothesis. Now, at this point, I think it is important to consider the time, the period that this research was conducted. which was during the global pandemic of COVID-19. And I personally think that maybe this had an impact, a negative impact on the participants' well-being, and maybe this is one of the reasons that we didn't find a positive correlation between those two variables. The third hypothesis was that participants who report more formal engagement in positive psychological habits would report higher levels of self-awareness. And again, we refuted this hypothesis. Now, a possible explanation of this finding could be the fact that by practicing the positive psychological habits in a formal way could actually result in automatizing the habit. Now, even though positive psychological habits teach us to be self-aware and it can decrease the automaticity of the habit, engaging with a habit in a scheduled way might result in engaging in the habit just for the sake of engaging. So in this way, the habit becomes automatic and something that the individual must do. And for this reason, it loses the actual meaning, which is to become self-aware and to relax. The fourth hypothesis was that participants who report more formal engagement in positive psychological habits will report higher levels of well-being. And again, we refuted this hypothesis. And I also believe that the fourth hypothesis is also associated with a second hypothesis because this research study was conducted during a global pandemic, and maybe the pandemic had a negative impact on participants' well-being. And finally, I found out that participants who report more frequent engagement in cognitive habits or in habits that include a cognitive element report higher levels of self-awareness. And again, I think that it has to do with the nature of the habit, that it requires self-awareness, but also it's mostly the cognitive habits or habits that include a cognitive element because maybe it's about the way that people are processing the information. So, for example, when someone is meditating, the habit requires self-awareness to be in place. However, when someone is jogging, they don't really have to be self-aware. The purpose of jogging is not to be self-aware. While when someone is practicing meditation, the purpose is to be self-aware at the moment. So now let's see why this study is important for the field of counseling. So from this presentation, you now know that it is more efficient to engage frequently to positive psychological habits than to formally engage to positive psychological habits in order to be self-aware. So by knowing that, if you're a counselor, you can now promote the frequent engagement of positive psychological habits to your clients if they want to become more self-aware, or if you believe that it will be beneficial for them to be self-aware. You also now know that it is more efficient to engage in cognitive psychological habits or on habits that include cognitive elements instead of physical habits in order to be self-aware. So again, now, if you're a counselor, you now know that it's the cognitive psychological habits or the habits that include cognitive element that can make your clients more self-aware. So this was my research project. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for listening.